Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 346. Today we're going to talk about Fire in the Lake. This is a review that is long overdue. A game I played a few times last year, 3 times to be exact, and then recently played it a 4th time. This is the 4th game in the Coin series. If you're not familiar with the Coin series, there's Andean Abyss, Cuba Libre, and A Distant Plain. It is a new style of design for quote-unquote your war game, but not like really any other war games that are out there. It's not like Squads and Hex Encounter or even big theaters like World War II. There's not a lot of combat necessarily, although this one does have probably more combat than the others. But it is a very interesting game. It's sort of a card-driven game in a sense, but not really. And now this is co-designed with Volker Runke and Mark Herman. And Mark Herman, of course, is famous for sort of inventing the card-driven style war game that we see in Twilight Struggle in 1989. He did it in We the People, and also For the People and Empire of the Sun, a couple other ones like that. So this is not really going to be too much of a walkthrough on how to play, because the core system of the Coin sort of system is really the same as it is in the other 3 games. And there's going to be a lot of nuance and detail and just tweaks in a way that make it adhere sort of to the history of the Vietnam conflict. Now the players in this game are interesting. It's the United States, of course. It's the ARVN, or the Southern Vietnamese government. It is the Viet Cong guerrillas, and it's also the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA. And so you can play this in a number of different ways. You can play it solo, you can play it 2-player, 3-player, 4-player, and there's a variety of sort of modes that you can play the game in. Now, if you were to play it 2-player, I, for example, could take on the United States as well as the South Vietnamese government and play against somebody else who was playing as the VC, the Viet Cong, and the NVA. But you could also play it solo and have these bots driven by sort of the computer, or the AI, if you will, of these flow charts. Now, there's a couple other ways to play the game. Of course, you can play it 4-player, and this is one of the things that I think this game really excels at. So I'm just going to jump in, like I said, to review. It's most like A Distant Plain if you were to compare it to the other Coin games, but it's a little bit more kind of fleshed out. And as soon as those words leave my mouth, as I often like to say, I feel there's a falseness to that. But you can set the deck up here for a historical sort of flavor, where you break the deck into chunks. You got 1964, 65, and 68. And so there's a loose sort of linear quality to the events if you want, or you could just mix them all up. Now, the long game for this, if you were to sort of do the long setup, is going to be quite lengthy, very lengthy. And I've attempted it 1 time and did not finish. However, I would say, I think for my money, the long game is probably the best way to play the game. The short way being easily my least favorite, because I think that the US, in a sense, has the upper hand with a short game. Now, the medium game is also nice because it gives especially the NVA, I think, a little bit more time to amass troops and get their trail built up, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which allows them to sort of traverse along the border of Vietnam a little bit easier, and also become a little more effective and just have some forces there to really counteract the US. Because if the US is able to get in and get out quickly, which I think was the idea back probably when this started, then they're able to succeed very well. So let's jump into a couple of little details, and so you can see some cool pictures of the components face up, and then I'll kind of go from there. Like I said, I'm not going to get into the details of how to play. I've actually done a walkthrough of how to play Cuba Libre. I think I only made 1 mistake, which is pretty good for me, especially playing this style game. If you played this on Vassal with me, I probably make 1 to 2 mistakes at least per game that we play. Anyway, a little secret there about me. So if you want to see how the Coin game system works, definitely go watch that playthrough of Cuba Libre. And there's also great reviews, not only my own, but some other folks have done reviews on the system itself. But we're just going to jump into how the Vietnam part of this sort of works. So first of all, we obviously have the name of the game, and that is Fire in the Lake. and there was a book written about this war entitled Fire in the Lake, and this is kind of where it gets its namesake from. And to a certain degree, haven't read this book or really read very many books about Vietnam, but there is a sort of, I think, a judgment in a way on some of the different factions in the game and how they're treated and what they're capable of and what their goals are. And as an example of that, let's take a look at the goals for both of the coin factions. Here we can see the South Vietnamese faction in yellow. They want the combined coin control, basically control of their pieces as well as the United States pieces on the board, plus patronage, which is kind of a fancy term for foreign aid from the United States government to apply, maybe however they wish. So the combined total of that to be greater than 50, whereas the United States itself actually is the one that wants support for the South Vietnamese government, and they want a certain number of available troops. So you can see here the United States itself actually has to keep track of the available number of troops. This is going to add, of course, to its point total, because remember, the United States was not viewed favorably back at home even for its participation in the war. So that's an example of a kind of indirect, maybe, judgment on the South Vietnamese government. And it very much reminds me of the Afghan government and its portrayal in A Distant Plain, where they are not necessarily out for it to the most altruistic ends. They are a government that wants to retain power, and by government I mean a loose collection of individuals, not necessarily how most people probably think of government as sort of supported by a people, and voted on necessarily in the best way. And the United States, of course, is in there trying to stem the tide of communism. So if you have a perspective and a political perspective that that's not the case, that the South Vietnamese wasn't necessarily just trying to maintain power, and that the United States was there to stop the evil NVA and Viet Cong from dominating the Southern Vietnamese, and they were there in an altruistic sense versus just trying to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, you may have issue with how the approach is taken. So the one thing to keep in mind with this, as you kind of go through the events, you go through some of the special ability cards and things that the players can get to. It does tell you a little bit about the history and about the perspective and in the multi-perspectives that you could view this sort of conflict with. So if we take a look here, you can see the card deck. Of course, you've got the icons at the top of the cards, which is the order of operations in terms of the eligible factions that can act. And then you've also got the events on the cards, and there's an unshaded section and a shaded section. In the unshaded section is usually in favor of what the coin factions want to do, and the shaded section is usually in favor of the insurgent faction, the NVA and the VC, and what they want to do. So of course, on your turn, you can take one of the available actions that's available to you, or you can execute the event. And based on how the matrix sort of shakes out, you may be able to do more or less awesome events. You may be able to do a full action with a special operation, or maybe just a limited operation. And so that's going to kind of shake out. You're going to see what the next card available is and so on. And that's really one of the cool things about this game that you don't usually see in a lot of these other games, is the duality of the history. And it's sort of like, here is Uncle Ho, right? The event. And, do we assassinate him early, so to speak? I don't know that the card really says that, but I've seen that card kind of come up early and give the United States a good shot, a really good stab at getting close to their victory condition, depending on how things shake out and how well the South Vietnamese is playing and how craftily they're playing. And so, or that card could be used for great effect to bolster up the NVA very, very quickly. So there's that duality there that's going to happen, and sort of an examination of the impact of the events, which is very interesting in terms of a historical perspective. And then from a gameplay perspective, there's a real interesting kind of dynamic that shows up here. So for example, getting back to this whole support issue of the South Vietnamese versus the United States actually being the ones that they want there to be a sort of a legitimacy to the South Vietnamese government, and then they want to get the heck out of Dodge. Whereas maybe the South Vietnamese is really trying to just milk, the United States for money and stuff to prop up, whatever their friends and everything like that. And so you have what happens in a lot of these coin games is this strange sort of brinkmanship of, getting sort of close to victory and then pulling away, and other factions doing something that sometimes is a little bit counterintuitive possibly to how you might be thinking somebody in this position would act. So by doing that, though, it helps you kind of engage with the history and, empathize, not necessarily sympathize, of course, but study a little bit of their perspective and the motivations of these people. And that is one thing that I find interesting about this game, is things are not as abstracted as I usually find with these games. With games in general, really. It puts you in a perspective of the sort of selfish personal motivation, even though that motivation might be coming from a good place in some ways, and maybe it was in history, but it lets you sort of examine that between sort of bouncing off either sort of executing an activation or an ability, and maybe getting some support, or getting an area under control, or doing an attack to swing control of an area, and doing that, bouncing that between the different events and things. So that's a very interesting dynamic, and it does come up. I like that they've done the historical sort of general outline that you can do here, because that is sort of educational and less what ify, even though there's a little bit more what if, as opposed to some of the other games where it can be kind of odd that some certain sequences of events would happen. You're like, that just, there was more causality here than you're seeing. But it's also, it's an interesting way to play the game. And so if we take a look inside of the playbook here, this is a very interesting matrix of how each faction can affect the different factions. And here we can see, again, the South Vietnamese government, how it can affect the U.S. positively and negatively. Positively, of course, it can take a pacification action, and that's similar to the civic action that you've seen in the other coin games. And if this will increase support, and the U.S. government can also take this action as well. Now, it can govern, basically converting aid into patronage, but doing so will actually reduce support. And another interesting faction in the game, the VC, the Viet Cong, a way that they can help the U.S. is they can tax a region, getting more resources that they can spend later. That will actually increase support. And then, of course, they can terror or agitate to reduce support. Now, the supplementary materials that come with the game talk a lot about the interesting relationship between the VC and the NVA. Now, like I said there, the VC, they can go in and sort of tax, and that's basically the way that they get resources. But that's going to lower support, or lower opposition in their case. And so they're trying to get up some bases and really drive opposition against the southern government. Whereas the NVA themselves, they just want to sort of take over the land. They are purely interested in control of territory. And so a lot of that, again, making judgment here, is stemming from, their benefactors, Russia, or Soviet Union in this case, and China trying to just, colonize, if you will, a lot of South Vietnam. Whereas the Viet Cong isn't necessarily so much interested in that. They're just very much against the southern government. Not necessarily, I don't think, in favor of the NVA itself, but they are very much the guerrilla arm of the NVA in a lot of ways. Basically a pain in the butt in South Vietnam. They've got these cool little tunnel bases that they can build. And these are bases here that will not get auto removed once all the guerrillas are gone, but the attacking player will need to roll a die to see if they're able to suss these out and then remove them altogether. Now, another key difference in the game, as you can see here, are the coup cards. These replace the propaganda cards, and they have a little bit different or extra effect above and beyond. The propaganda basically triggers a scoring round. Everybody kind of gathers their resources, does a little bit of support or agitation, and these will do that. But these are basically big political swings in the current state of the southern government. Another neat mechanic here are these pivotal events. Now, each faction has one pivotal event. Now, you can play this only if there are 2 or more RVN leaders in the coup box. As you can see, some of these coups are actually failed attempts. But once there's 2 or more leader cards in there, then each of the different factions has a condition where they can play this event and do a very big, massive operation. Here we can see the Tet Offensive, which the Viet Cong can play. And so these are targets that the players will want to keep in mind throughout the game, to be mindful of other players hitting. And some of the factions can actually play their pivotal event in response to another faction's play of a pivotal event. Finally, let's talk a little bit about the troop deployment as well as the troop movement. Now here we see the trail, and this is going to be used by the North Vietnamese Army to change up how quickly they can move troops up and down the border. It's also going to allow more and more troops to be deployed in North Vietnam, and it's something that all players want to keep in mind. And another interesting thing about the way troops are deployed on the map, there's a few different things, is some of the factions, the best way, the only way to get troops out of the border is with special operations. So it's not always the easiest thing to go and rally and just, train and build up troops just like that. You can't just do that as a limited op necessarily. You've got to exercise and have available to you in the first place these special operations to get those troops out at all. And then there's also the casualty box in the case of the United States and the ARVN, where some of those troops are going to be removed out of play, and you're not going to be able to necessarily deploy those back in. And so the interesting thing about that is it makes it difficult to sort of control from the US perspective your support level, because in a lot of ways you kind of want to get in and get out, but if you don't get in and you've kind of committed so many troops there to the field of battle, it's going to drag down support quite a bit. So that's a very interesting mechanic and how that kind of works. So what do I think of the game in general? Well, I like the different modes. Like I said, I think the long mode is probably the best way to play. I think you're going to get the most bang for your buck, and you can see, sort of the quagmire, just the epic quagmire that this whole thing really is. And it very much evolved, nice and slowly over the course of several hours. And I think that's the best way to play it, because it gives you a real good sense of what everybody's goals were, when they could have and should have and maybe, would have done their actions. And it gives you a real good sense of, I think, what was at stake and what were some of the obstacles they hit and a lot of the blunders and the missteps. And it's very much a commentary, I think, in a lot of ways on this style of conflict. And I think it's very important a game in a lot of ways because of that, and it's an important war in some ways because of that. I think it's also interesting in the way that they sort of round out a lot of the elements that I saw happen in A Distant Plain, where you have this sort of government that, in this case, the South Vietnamese versus the Afghani government, not the greatest government with the most, altruistic of motives, and we're kind of dealing with them for one degree or another with our own agenda, where in the case of Afghanistan, we're trying to hunt down Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and get rid of them, and sort of set up a front line, if you will, in the war on terror. And this was sort of the similar idea with sort of a front line with the communist expansion that may or may not have been happening. I'm trying not to be political here because I don't really care about that, honestly. I'm more of a sort of trying to sit back and sort of absorbing it a little bit without trying to make too many judgments. So anyway, there's that. I think, so I'm at the point here where I've got the 4 coin games in the series, and going through them and go, which one do I like best? A lot of people ask me that a lot. I think I like this one a little bit better because it feels like it's a little bit more rounded out, fleshed out. You can play different modules. You can play the different scenarios with, basically 1, 2, 3, and 4 players, and you can shape that out a little bit. I think this one, if you're going to choose the coin games, if you want a heavy, big one, I would choose this one, unless you really are interested in the theater of A Distant Plain. Now, the other 2 games in the series, Cuba Libre and Andean Abyss, are the shorter of the games, especially Cuba Libre, and there's a little bit less to take in. So if you want to interested in the system itself, Cuba Libre would probably be my first suggestion there, because the map's smaller and it plays a little bit quicker. And when you play the short game, in those games, it doesn't feel quite as unbalanced as this one does with the short game. And even with A Distant Plain, Distant Plain is, it's a weird sort of balancing act, that one. I just don't think there's a lot that you can really say about that type of conflict, because it's such a bizarre conflict. I really enjoy these 2-player because you have to sort of get the victory conditions of both factions. So both coin factions need to happen and both insurgent factions need to happen. So you play it from a perspective of a better outlook, a more sort of idealistic outlook. Even if you're playing NVA and Viet Cong or ARVN in the US, when you play that two-player, it's a more altruistic, idealistic, sort of probably unrealistic approach on it. And that goes for a lot of these games. It's a difficult thing to really pin down. It's because you can come at this from so many different angles. This is really difficult. So anyway, I'm keeping this one. This is the end of the day. I'm keeping this one. I'm going to get rid of a distant plane. Not because I don't like it anymore, but because there's so much room on my shelf. And I'm going to keep Cuba Libre and Andean Abyss. And I also know that there's at least 2 more coming out this year. One is on the American Revolution, and the other is, I believe it's in Rome or something. So yeah, I'm excited to see how they apply that system to there. And that's the other cool thing about this is I kind of feel like a little bit like, oh, they're just kind of cranking these out, but it's become a thing. It's kind of got a life of its own, the coin series, where if you take a look at like, Advanced Squad Leader, and you could take a look and say, from that sort of core, which also has its roots in Squad Leader, which has its roots in, however many other war games, you've got games like Ghost, Panzer, and War Stories, and Conflict of Heroes. And so I could see this coin system, in a sense, evolving into a lot of different games. Similar to how the card-driven game has evolved, where you had We the People, and then you eventually had Twilight Struggle, where if you played it for the ops, the events would trigger for the other player. So I could see there's something like still yet to be discovered about this this series. And one of the things that a lot of people that I've heard people say, and I haven't seen too much of it, but I have seen it happen, is you have sort of that abrupt coup card, that propaganda card that just cuts everybody's legs out from underneath them, and you've got the whole sort of bring down the leader conundrum with this game and this series. So to me, those aren't deal breakers at all. I don't mind it because it keeps you on your toes, and it keeps you sort of waiting for that card flip and to see what happens. And the surprise of things is a lot of times, I guess, in war, you can see that having probably the biggest outcome, the biggest effect on the outcome. So, but I still think I see there's probably something that could change to fix that. I don't know what that is at all, but I can see that being played with a little bit, that card mechanism. There's a lot of the nuance in here in terms of like, do I want control versus support? I mean, we've seen that a lot with this one versus a distant plane. And, you can see, how to move troops around and how to activate guerrillas and choosing the activities versus the event. I think that's being really well explored right now with all 4 of these games, and those nuances applied to the different theaters. But the card deck thing hasn't really changed. So I expect, maybe not in the next 2, but I expect there's somebody out there is going to be designing this, and they're going to tweak that card flip, and it's going to be more than just order of operations plus 2 events. There's something more that you can add to. Anyway, thanks.